Welcome back to the Mass Effect HYPEcast for episode number 9. I'm your host, Morgan, aka Bond Diesel, and this is a podcast about Mass Effect, the future of BioWare's premier franchise, and all of our speculation and ideas for the next game. It's been a quiet time for Mass Effect and BioWare, probably for good reason. They, in the last 6 months, wrapped up development on Dragon Age of the Veilguard. They released it. It came out. It was great. I really enjoyed it. That's a bit of a controversial take to some people, but I suspect the most who listen to this, it won't be, at least not too much. I've been keeping my eye out for any updates, any leaks, things like that. I think the most notable news that's come out fairly recently was they are hiring again. There's the first listing on BioWare's career website in quite a while. And it's, as far as I can tell, the first one that is likely for Mass Effect in like 2.5 years. So we have to keep in mind the kind of recent history of everything. They did some hiring in the last year and a half, but that was specifically for Dragon Age, the Veilguard. We also found out, after release, that the small Mass Effect pre-production team, didn't do that for about a year and a half almost, to help ship the Dragon Age game. So that hiring listing is exciting. It's for a art director job, I believe, which isn't a technical art director, I believe, which isn't what you assume. That's from what I can tell and from what I've been told by some devs that I interact with. It's more of a coordinator position. It's not necessarily someone who's sitting down and making technical art, but it's more someone who's trying to get all of the different people and pieces to work together and to efficiently do things. So that's exciting. That's something at this point. I think with BioWare, Mass Effect, everything, all news is good news at this point. So, but I also think people should probably expect a bit of a delay. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about, inspired by some other people. I basically blasted all of my social media and Reddit and YouTube and everything with what features or mechanics from the original trilogy do you want in the next game? And so we have a nice long list of those things to talk about. I'm also going to talk about that senior technical artist job, as well as a 2025 in 7-day wish list. We'll do a little speculation at the end. Before we jump into all of that, though, the last thing I'll say is that Mike Gamble did, just in the last day, I'm recording this on the 11th of April, did just tell someone that he had just gotten out of a review. I'm told that that's probably an internal thing, probably with other people on the pre-production team, but it's still something, and I'll take it. So let's get into the rest of the show. Okay, so for the first topic, wish list for old features or mechanics from the first 4 games, what we want to see in the next one. So like I said, I posted this on all my social media channels and pages. I posted on my YouTube community area as well as Reddit, which got the most response. It was really good. So I'm going to go through, looks like I have about a dozen, if not maybe a couple more. And I'll talk about the feature, what game or games it came from, and kind of my thoughts on that. So the first one was easily the most popular. The one that was requested the most was the return of the Paragon and Renegade system. This is from the trilogy, very notably left out of the Andromeda game. People very specifically also mentioned the interrupts. So if you remember during especially Mass Effect 3, but in 2 as well, that there'd be moments where you could use a Paragon or a Renegade interrupt that would stop the scene, and you would either punch somebody or settle down a conversation or something. And people also really want this Paragon Renegade system to kind of affect the story and the choices and things that happen. So I've had this idea as well. I'm going to make a whole separate video about this so I can talk more in depth about it. But my basic idea was to have some kind of like more behind the scenes Paragon Renegade system, but have it come back. It's a morality system, right? So if you've played a lot of RPGs, they have something like this. Um, I would really love for them to do this again, but make it, like I said, a little more behind the scenes. Maybe we don't necessarily need 2 meters in your menu that show you where you're at on the Paragon Renegade. Maybe we can express that in other ways. And I definitely don't want to have red and blue text in the dialogue selection, right? I would like to be able to figure those things out myself. I would like it to be part of the game, part of the experience of playing the game, to figure out what choices are going which way. That does require that in the future games they make the dialogue selection text a little more accurate. There's so many times in a lot of games, but especially in the Mass Effect games, where especially if it didn't have the blue and red, you could just read what it says and be like, oh yeah, that's what I want. And you select a dialogue choice and it's like not what Shepard would say at all. And you just be like, like that's not what I wanted. So if they do a more subtle system, they would have to make sure that that part works out a little bit better. But I would love a morality system, specifically Paragon Renegade, in the next game that would impact like what romances you can have, or even just more platonic relationships. One thing I liked about Andromeda is that if you weren't romancing a character, you could still like build a friendship with them that was more than just superficial, which I really enjoyed. I would like it to, your morality to determine what choices you can make, especially in the main story of the game. I feel like you shouldn't just be able to always make all the choices. I think that you should have to go down a path. And I feel like, like the story outcomes, the way that, whether people live or die, or whether, some things happen or don't happen, should be really dependent on all the choices you've made throughout the whole game. Instead of just, being a very clear red or blue dialogue selection, or for it not to matter at all. That was a big issue in Andromeda, is there's very little. There are some choices that impact the game, for sure. I'm not going to act like there's none. They're very few and they're very subtle and they don't make much of an impact. And that was especially frustrating because, like, I understand that in the trilogy, especially in 3, they can only do so much, right? Because they already had so many choices they had to deal with and all that. But Andromeda was literally a new start. And they could have done whatever they wanted, and they still didn't. And that was really frustrating. I get why it didn't happen for, probably resource and time reasons. But that was frustrating. So yeah, the Paragon Renegade system returning in some capacity would be a big deal. And I think it would just be a good advertising thing to point out, like, and yes, we have the return of the Paragon Renegade system, but a little different, and then go into that. I think it's really iconic to the trilogy. And I think that, I've talked a lot about Andromeda and I won't go too much into it again, but one of the big issues I had with Andromeda is it just felt like a generic sci-fi game that had some Mass Effect stuff in it. That it wasn't a game that like really leaned into the fact that it was a Mass Effect game, just with new characters and a new place. And I feel like not having things like the Paragon Renegade system and all of that, if they would have just had that system in there, it would have just made it feel more attached to the rest of the IP in the franchise. So I think with the next game, they're definitely going to have that issue as well. It's going to be coming out 15 plus years after Mass Effect 3. It's going to be coming out 10 plus years after Andromeda. I think finding ways to harken back to history, to the nostalgia to a point of the franchise, and the Paragon Renegade system being a part of that, is going to be pretty essential to the next Mass Effect game. And I think it'd be a really good idea for them to do that again. Another thing that people want to bring back was the class restrictions. Let me be very clear, to start with this one especially. There were people who were for and against some of these things. I'm going to argue the stance that I personally agree with, but do keep in mind that these things weren't completely agreed on by everyone. There were definitely, pushes and pulls and all of this. But the class restrictions, so this can mean a lot of things. What I mean with this is that, you played basically as one class through all three games, even though I know you could change it of the trilogy. And then when you wanted to play the game again, you would just pick a different class and have a slightly different playthrough, right? I liked it for replayability. Now, other people brought up restrictions of like certain classes can only wear certain kinds of armor, heavy, medium, light. Certain classes can only use certain guns, which is something that got loosened up a little bit in the legendary edition, where I didn't even know this, but you couldn't use all the guns for all the characters in the original games in Mass Effect 1. And then in Legendary Edition, they opened it up, but I think you get bonuses for them using the guns they're actually adept for. And then Mass Effect 2, even in the Legendary Edition, without mods, you are restricted based on your class. And I don't like it. I never enjoyed that when I'm playing this modded playthrough right now. And being able to pick everything is in my opinion, better. So I don't really care necessarily about like the weapons thing. With the armor, I'm more open to that, to having that restricted to the kind of class you are. But for me, a big one is, and a lot of people really like the Andromeda system where there was like no class basically. You could pick and choose abilities and bonuses from all the different classes, and you could change them on the fly. Andromeda famously, you can have profiles where in the middle of combat, you could have like a biotic and do biotic things, and then switch to like a soldier and detonate your biotic things as a soldier class. And that was probably a lot of fun. And I don't blame people for wanting that again. I would like to find a happy medium somewhere. I felt like there was a real identity when you would do a playthrough as a certain class in the trilogy, and not being able to switch all willy-nilly, And so I think maybe they can leave it a little looser. Maybe they don't have to completely restrict it down like they did in the trilogy. Maybe take some influence from Andromeda. But I really felt like it kind of almost erased the idea of classes. And I get that with Sam. It was part of the game, but I personally didn't like it. And so some of these things I agree, some of these I don't, but I think bringing back that system would be pretty cool. A pretty common one was people asking for more mature themes and writing. The kind of, it's been talked about a lot, but like the CW style of Andromeda being so different in tone from the original trilogy. I during live streams have talked a lot about how, I think that implies that like the original trilogy was super duper serious and everything. And it wasn't. The original trilogy is silly, especially after the first game. Mass Effect 2 and especially Mass Effect 3. Hell, the whole DLC, the Citadel DLC in the third game is just a big running joke, right? I think what's different about the trilogy compared to Andromeda and just some other games is that it had a grounded like aesthetic. It was a very grounded game while still being a space sci-fi game. And it had serious themes and undertones, and it had moments of lightheartedness, whether it was jokes or cheesy lines or whatever, but it didn't inundate you with them. The Andromeda, a big issue I've always had with the writing is that it is very constantly being sarcastic and silly and funny. And that would be okay if it was more balanced, but at least in my opinion, it wasn't. It's even a slight problem in Dragon Age the Veilguard, where I think it did a better job of having a little more seriousness, but it was still very forceful. Some of the characters, one in particular, was just very in your face about like just trying to like just not very subtle, I guess, which isn't always bad, but sometimes is. For better or worse, obviously OG fans would say worse. Effectively, the entire writing staff of BioWare got let go or left in the last 6 months. We know that Mary DeMarley, who came from Eidos, who worked on Deus Ex and the Guardians of the Galaxy game, is the narrative director. She's new. I've also seen there are a few other people who are there. I've seen some people saying that Mary DeMarley is like the only writer at BioWare right now. That's not true. That I don't think would even be possible in their pre-production. They need more people than just Mary to be writing all this stuff. I have seen a handful of people at BioWare who are still there, who are on that writing team, but they aren't like the old school OG people. They are new, and that could be bad or it could be good. And I think that people should be open to either of those possibilities. You can still be upset about over the last year and a half, 2 years, effectively all of the OG writers at BioWare getting let go. But I also think, when you look at the kind of general reception, even from Dragon Age fans of Veilguard, I think you'll see a lot of people like the combat, thought the game looked nice. It was solid. It wasn't buggy. It released in really good shape. It had a lot of positives, but one of the almost universal negatives was the writing and the dialogue and the story. And while a lot of that, unfortunately, was pushed by a bunch of the grifters and just the worst people in the gaming community, I also have seen a lot of people who aren't in that, who are legit BioWare fans, Mass Effect fans, Dragon Age fans, who have been like, look, I love the game, but the obvious is the weaknesses are pretty obvious, and it all mostly comes back to those things, and I appreciate that. So I'm never going to celebrate layoffs and things like that. I think it sucks. I wish that there would have been a different way. I hope the best for all those people who are no longer there, but I do hope that a new narrative director, maybe some new writers, can maybe kind of make those things better for this next Mass Effect game. And I will note specifically that after Veilguard came out, someone replied to Mike Gamble, who's the head of the next Mass Effect game, but also helped ship Veilguard, I think kind of rudely, was like, oh, please tell us the next Mass Effect game will be more serious or whatever. And it was, I forget what the exact quote was, I'm paraphrasing, but Gamble basically was like, yeah, it's going to be a very serious tone game. I hope it still has the levity of the trilogy. But it was interesting that he replied very candidly. It almost felt like a little bit of a shot at Veilguard of being like, no, don't worry, we're going to be serious. So take from that what you will. The next one I have is previous choices mattering. So in the trilogy, this is where it was most noted. Obviously, Andromeda is pretty light when it comes to your choices actually impacting the game. Even the trilogy, though, like if you go through to Mass Effect 3, lots of things you did in 1 and 2 didn't actually impact the last game, but a lot of it did. And I think people want that again. And it doesn't have to be gigantic monumental stuff. One example I gave is Avowed. When you do side missions in Avowed, it gets noticed and talked about by your companions, by people in the world, and people during main missions. And some of those side things either make a main mission easier because you have an ally that you gained by doing that side mission, and they'll talk about the thing you did. It's not giant, huge game impacting things, but it's that like reactivity that people talk about a lot of feeling like everything you do in the game matters in some way. Now, this could also be taken as hoping that things from, the first 4 games matter in this next game. And I'm like 50-50 on that. I think if they try to take every possible difference or choice that you made in the trilogy or even Andromeda and make that impact the next game in some way, you're going to have a game that is dead from the start, because they're going to have to spend so much time accounting for all of those things from the trilogy and Andromeda that they won't be able to start again. I'm a big proponent of the next game. I'm cool if they want to make a bunch of canon choices. I think there's some things that they should leave alone, who Shepard romanced and some things like that. But I think the ending, they have to canonize. I think the Geth Quarian choice, they have to canonize. I hope that they do peace. That's the best way to move it forward, especially if they canonize Destroy ending. I think they need to canonize what happens with the Genophage. Even though, spoilers, I guess, if you're listening to this, it probably isn't. If you don't cure the Genophage, if you trick them, and especially if Morden lives, Morden even says that he will cure it eventually. And then I think there's even the implication that Malin or one of his assistants would likely cure it eventually anyways, but that's a different story. I think they need to do that. They need to canonize some of those things, because the next game, they really almost need to narrow down the lore and the story from the previous games for the next one, so that they can then re-expand it. Because if they come into the next game with these, like, say there's 100 different things that could impact the next game that happened in the original four, that's where they're going to start and then have to expand from there. It's just not going to work. Where if they narrow it down to maybe there's a few choices that could still be, kind of like what happened in Veilguard, where you could pick a few things. I hope it's more in depth than that. One of the major complaints about Veilguard was how little the things that you did in the previous games impacted that one. So do better than that, I guess. But I still think they just have to narrow it down. And when it comes to like canonizing the end of Mass Effect 3 and stuff, I don't think you necessarily have to say like, oh, if you picked Control and Synthesis, you're wrong. You can just say, hey, we're moving this franchise forward. Those endings are valid. We put them in there for a reason, but we're deciding to go with this one path, and you can still have a world where those other ones mattered, but we're going to do this. Because I truly believe that I've seen people propose, basically combining all the endings and trying to find a way to kind of basically brush it off, and whatever happens in the next game, to be able to kind of ignore whatever choice was made. I don't love that, because especially Synthesis compared to Control, compared to Destroy, those are so drastically different endings that would have like permanent impacts on the galaxy. I don't think you can just hand wave it. And I truly believe that hand waving it is disrespectful to everyone, where you could pick the most popular ending, or at least one that was actually a choice. And I feel like that's just more respectful of the player base. But that's a whole different diatribe. I'm going to move on from this one, but making sure previous choices matter, it was a big topic. New Game Plus, this was a big one. The person who talked about it specifically mentioned Andromeda, and how you can take your gear and your skills and all your progression and do a new playthrough. And I completely agree. I know you can do that kind of, I think in Mass Effect 3, I can't remember if you can do it in 1 or 2. I've never done it. But having that ability, it is just fun if you've ever done a New Game Plus. And obviously they can tweak, the enemies and stuff to make sure it's still a challenge. But being able to go into a playthrough fully juiced up is really cool. So I completely agree with that one. Another one was companion missions linked to the story, like in Andromeda, which I agree with as well. That's what I talked about with the Avowed thing, making choices matter. Don't, some of the side missions and companion missions and all of that were literally completely side stories from the game, that can work. And I don't want that to go away completely, but it would be cool if more of that stuff tied into the main story. Especially, I'm not expecting this next Mass Effect game to be some big 100-hour experience. I'm expecting it to be a probably smaller experience, especially if the hope is to make multiple games, maybe another trilogy. I don't expect it or even want it to be some 100-hour epic. I would love for it to be a nice solid 25 or 30 hours. And with a bunch of these things we've talked about or will talk about, give replayability. Make it so I can try, I can have 8 different playthroughs with 8 different classes and 8 different sets of choices that have 8 different endings, subtle or not so subtle. I think this is cool. I think it's a good idea. This is part of that, making companion missions more linked to the story, like in Andromeda. I like that a lot. The personality system in Andromeda as well. While we talked about Paragon and Renegade, having that come back in some capacity, I don't just want the blue and red text, right? Like that's at least not for me. I also don't necessarily want, but maybe it's useful for the up selection to be Paragon, the down selection to be Renegade, and the middle selection to be like kind of neutral. Like, maybe make it more complicated than that. That is one of the things I liked about Andromeda, is that you could have like a flirtatious response. You could have a friendly response. You could have a joking response. Maybe a little too much of that, but it made it a more in-depth system. It wasn't just good, bad, neutral. So I completely agree with that one. The gun overheating system for Mass Effect 1, someone put in there. I agree. Even just as nostalgia bait, obviously in Mass Effect 3, during the Citadel DLC, you can find like the original, was it the M7 or whatever, that had that system, and it is great. I love it. I think that they can maybe do something in the middle. One of the things I've talked about, and it goes back to that lore conversation of narrowing things down. Not only do I hope they narrow things down with this next game to make it able to expand again, but I would love for them to kind of retcon some things, to clear some stuff up. There's so much about the lore of Mass Effect that just makes no sense. Timelines that make no sense, choices and things that you can tell that they just kind of threw it all together over those, like, they released 3 games in like a handful of years. And you can tell that that led to a bunch of the lore and stuff like that to be kind of messy. And so I hope that they take a chance, especially because it's been so many years since the games came out. Maybe people are a little more open to things being, retconned or adjusted. I think that the gun overheating system can be part of that, where they decide to maybe we'll do that with some guns, maybe not with others, or whatever. Yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing that back as well. Some kind of mechanical stuff here, squad power usage and control. In Andromeda, you literally can't control your companions at all. I think a system kind of like what Veilguard had could be okay, where they're like semi-autonomous, but you can still tell them what to do, like using certain skills and things like that. I really think the system in Veilguard of the charge and detonate works extremely well. I really, really enjoyed that. Yeah, more control again would be good. Andromeda, it's strange every time I play it how your companions, like, they help, I guess, kind of. Their AI is terrible, but they, you don't really have that much control over what they do, and I think that'd be good to have that back. Squad banter from Andromeda is a big one. I completely agree. I love the way that your companions interact, especially in the not the Tempest. Oh, not the Mako. You'll know what I'm talking about if you're listening to this. The vehicle. Some really fun conversations that can be had in that vehicle, and some funny stuff that can be reactive to things happening in the story or not. But even in the Tempest, when you're walking around the ship, some of the interactions that can happen there, it's just, Andromeda, it was obviously much more advanced in the way they had like roaming companions and things like that, and kind of kept things a little more interesting. I definitely would love to have that back. The ability to change squad mate armor and weapons, like in Mass Effect 1, into a point in 2 and 3. Yes, I agree with that. I really liked being able to, especially in Mass Effect 1, completely change armor and everything for each companion. And 2 and 3 it gets a lot more restricted. I kind of get it. It's the thing that people forget about the trilogy, the original trilogy, is the first game and the third game all released on the same generation of consoles. And so as you saw fidelity get better, you saw scale shrink between the 3 games. And that led to, I think very unfortunately, by the third game, the games look pretty good, and still to this day they look pretty good. But it means that the scale is like minuscule because they didn't have much more to work with tech wise. I really, really wish the third game would have been released on the next gen of systems, the PS4 and the Xbox One, because it probably would have allowed them to make that game closer to a vision they actually wanted. But, we all know why that didn't happen. Or if you don't, you should look into it. They were pushed to make Mass Effect 3 pretty quickly. But yeah, the ability to change their weapons and armor and be much more customized about it, I think would be really, really cool for the next game. Multiple significant hub spaces like Andromeda. I agree with that. Obviously, Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3 have those hub spaces, especially 2 and 3. But I still think Andromeda does it extremely well. I don't necessarily want the open worldness of Andromeda back. But those really big like cities that you could explore and find secrets and side missions and kind of references back to the trilogy and stuff, that'd be super cool. I hope that they continue on with that. The random missions of Mass Effect 1, just the weird stuff you could come up upon. I agree with that, and a pretty big part. Mass Effect 1, I think it's the lack of pressure of the first game that I really enjoy every time I play it, that you really do feel like you're just this squad of people going around the galaxy and figuring stuff out. And that's always been a very, something I really hope for the next game. The combat system, this one was interesting because you definitely see a divide of people that prefer the more like Gears of War style combat of the, especially 2 and 3 Mass Effect, or the much more like fluid and movement based combat of Andromeda. I'm like somewhere in the middle. Every time people talk about combat in Andromeda, they always talk about how fun the combat is. And I am someone who actually completely disagrees. I love third person shooters, and I think the gunplay is terrible in Andromeda. The cover system is abysmal. The AI, both enemy and friendly, is terrible. It's just not a very good feeling game to play combat wise, in my opinion. I do like the skill usage, and I hope that they kind of take from that in the next game. I think the skill usage of like the biotic powers and the tech powers actually feels pretty good. The jump jets are always the big conversation. I like the idea of the jump jets being an option, but I really dislike in Andromeda just that the entire game was designed around the jump jets. Like it's so hard to like argue against that. Like everything, the traversal, the entire game is designed around having jump jets. And it just, to me, like they're a cool idea. I would love to see them be a feature of maybe certain classes in the next game, but I kind of hope they get away from making it so obviously like one of the main focuses of the just how you traverse and do everything in the next game. Hub and mission instead of open world. I talked a bit about this. There's been rumors that this is the case, that they're fairly unsubstantiated at this point. But considering I expect them to try to make this next Mass Effect game like fairly quickly, all things considered, it's going to be a lot easier to make like a hub and mission style game, kind of like Veilguard or the original trilogy, than trying to make some big open world game that has like 20 planets with giant explorable areas. I don't think that's what they're going to do this time, and I'm okay with that. I don't really want that. I have plenty of games to do that, if I want to do that big open world exploration. So I would love to see that with just purpose built mission areas and missions, smaller scale, corridor fighting, finding ships on the galaxy map and docking with them and having fights inside those, or solving puzzles and mysteries and all that I would love to get back to kind of to that feel. Someone said Omnigel. That cracked me up. They even make jokes about it in the second game, the power broker the mission. They talk about Omnigel in that, so that could be part of that, like getting fixing up some of the lore and getting that all patched back up. It'd be nice to see that get reincorporated, maybe explain it a bit more. The jump jets already talked about, and then companion selection. Yeah, it'd be cool like if your crew could have like 8 spots, but they make like 12 companions that through the game you can pick. And maybe due to your Paragon Renegade score or choices you make, some companions may leave your ship or won't join you, or will even betray you, say at the end or something. So you have to manage those relationships and consider your choices and things like that. Obviously with romances as well. Yeah, I love the idea of not just, there's 6 companion spots. You recruit your 6 companions. That's all the companions in the game. Each shepherd gets, one romance for this and one romance for that, and or whoever the next player character is. I would like more variety there. Now that's obviously a huge ask, because what you're essentially saying is make multiple characters that may barely ever get used by anyone. And that would suck, for that voice actor, for the writing staff, for the people who have to make all those animations and all that. I think it'd be cool for replayability and for lots of reasons to have it be a little more fluid, what happens with that. So that was kind of my compiled list. I thought it was really great. I had a really good time reading through all those and obviously talking about them right now. And hopefully we'll see that some stuff come from that, but we'll probably have to wait a bit. Like I said before, the second topic I had on here was that they are hiring a senior technical artist now. This is the first Mass Effect job listing, presumably Mass Effect, that they've had in a few years. I think if you're someone like me who's looking for any sign of anything from Mass Effect and BioWare, this is good. They had to run it up the line. I'm sure that they had to get approvals to post a listing like this. It's one of those things that any motion from BioWare is a good sign right now, in my opinion. Someone asked me, oh, does this mean that they're going into full production? I would expect like a dozen listings to pop up, and that will probably be a sign that they are imminently moving into full production, because they're likely going to be trying to pull back from people who have been sent off to other studios as those other studios ship their games, as Battlefield comes out, as the Iron Man game comes out, and so on and so forth. Skate as well. There's BioWare devs who left BioWare to go work at all those studios. They're permanently at those studios now. But I've been told specifically by a few of them that it was implied that they'd be able to come back when there's job listings again for BioWare. And so hopefully we see that. One of the people specifically told me they came to BioWare and they ended up working on Veilguard. They came there to work on Mass Effect. That was the game they came there to work on. And now they're at another studio working on another game. And they're happy to have a job, but sounds like they really want to come back and work on Mass Effect. So hopefully that happens for them. But yeah, once we see a big jump in listings on that careers page, I suspect that's when we'll get some kind of confirmation. I assume this year that they'll be moving into full production. It could happen at any time, really. In 7 days, maybe a natural place for them to announce that. We'll have to wait and see. And then the final topic for this podcast is N7 Day itself. We got a light one in 2024. We know that. Veilguard had just come out. They were pretty clear, maybe a little too late in my opinion, but it's fine. Not everyone is paying attention to it the way I do. That it was going to be a light one. They released some intriguing new armors for Veilguard that were Mass Effect related. I think in the future, we'll look back at that and it probably will have meant more than we realize right now, as well as some other little hints and teases, but nothing big. You go back to 2023, we had the trailer with the Agent N7 and the poster that came after that had the bar scene that has Geth in it, that has Angara in it, that has potentially Ralloy in it, as well as some other interesting things in there. For 2025, I'm expecting it to be pretty significant. We will assume that pre-production team has been back on Mass Effect for about a year by the time N7 Day happens. I'm really hoping that means that they at least give us a bunch of concept art and other assets that they can tease us with. I'm not expecting them to give us like a subtitle or the title of the game or a release date or anything like that. But I am hoping that by then they're in full production, that they will have a bunch of stuff they can show us. Maybe a trailer. I'm not going to count on that, but it would be cool. I hope that the intent is that since they barely showed us anything last year in 2024, that 25 will end up being a much bigger show, a much bigger thing. At the end of the day, I hope it happens at all. We hope that BioWare doesn't get shut down and all the devs laid off and the project canceled. I tend to be more optimistic than that. So I think it'll be, my guess is it'll be the most significant N7 Day we've had yet, because you have to consider that basically from here on, we'll only get more info about Mass Effect. Like if they start full production this year, if you look at the way that they talked about Dragon Age the Veilguard, from the day that they announced it, which was about 3 years before it came out, they announced full production. They pretty consistently released info about it, over how they were making choices about gameplay and mechanics and all that. And then especially obviously in the lead up to it releasing, they talked a ton about it. So I suspect it will only ramp up, the amount of info we get about the next Mass Effect over the next few years. And I hope that 2025 is when that kicks off. And that is where I'm going to wrap up this show. Thank you for listening. Obviously, we're kind of going on not a whole lot right now. I wanted to talk about Mass Effect, so I wanted to make another episode. So thanks for listening to this episode. Subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, and subscribe to the Bon Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including this podcast. Thank you to everyone who supports as a YouTube member or Twitch subscriber. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and all of my other content, please check out the links in the show description. If you have questions or feedback, comment on Spotify or YouTube. let me know in my Discord or hit me up on social media at Bondiesel or at Mass Effect HYPEcast. You can find links to all of those in the link tree in the description of the show. That is all I have for this episode of the Mass Effect HYPEcast. So until next time.